starting off with the ACC. North Carolina sports betting launched in the Tar Heel State, North Carolina, on Monday. So remember, if you're listening to us and you're a resident in North Carolina, haven't signed up for any sports betting promos, you could do so with the best bonus codes over at thelines.com. BetMGM, the ACC tournament odds, has Duke plus 190, UNC second shortest odds after beating Duke on Saturday to clinch the outright ACC regular season championship at plus 200. Clemson plus 700. Wake Forest plus 900. Pitt also plus 900. Virginia plus 1,200 in that disgusting offense. And Vatech plus 2,500. Before we get into my bet for this conference, Eric, I want to get the listeners and viewers a little bit of behind the curtains look at what goes into your projections, not only for this conference and individual games, but Haslametrics in general, widespread college basketball.
Yeah, so what I do from an analytical standpoint is I kind of avoid the four factors that a lot of different people are going to use in their analytics. What I end up doing is I broke things down and kind of do a matrix, looking at shot performance, shot selection, and shot situations, and then kind of breaking things down into a matrix like that. Looking at, is a team more likely to shoot the three-pointer? Are they going to take a lot of mid-range shots? Are they going to get close to the rim, what I call near proximity? Then you're looking at the percentage, the performance of all three of those, and you're measuring that as well. And on top of that, you're looking at special situations, things that might result in a higher field goal percentage, such as quick points off of second chance rebounds, quick points off of turnovers, things like that. So I'm looking at those opportunities that teams create for themselves. And when you break that all down, you can get a measurement of all these teams and create these transitive comparisons behind the scenes. The example I always use is if Wisconsin plays Michigan and Wisconsin plays Michigan State, you now have a comparison between Michigan and Michigan State using Wisconsin as the constant. Well, you form that one particular comparison early on, and you have tens upon tens of thousands of these comparisons that you form throughout the season. And from that, you're able to come with these, what I call these baseline ratings against the average, the generically average Division I opponent. And when you do that, you can create a projected final for any outcome for any game between two Division I teams. And those records, what I call the all play percentage, is exactly what dictates the rankings that you see. So if you see a team that has an all play percentage of 1, which is 1.000, means that they would be favored per my site against every other team in Division I college basketball. And right now there is a team that is that's Houston right now, not very uncommon. That's not going to say they're going to win every single time. It would say that my analytics would favor them in every single contest on a neutral court.
And as we look at some of the odds for the ACC tournament, not just the ones I mentioned to win the league tournament, but first round games tipping off on Tuesday, along with the Big 12, A10, but we'll touch on Big 12 odds a little bit later on. Louisville, no surprise, and Kenny Payne's retirement tour, I don't know if you want to call it that, or maybe his funeral against NC State. Wolfpack are 8.5-point home favorites, and just for context, if you look at what Haslam has over at his site, NC State, an 11-point favorite. So if you believe, or just below that, I should say. So if you believe the Wolfpack will win by double digits and maybe Haslam has an edge on the actual point spread, we'll see where the number closes, considering it's a 1.5-point differential with the betting odds as of this recording on Monday night. Then maybe you want to take a look at NC State. You probably don't want to take a look at Louisville, though, to win the conference tournament, Eric. One bet that I did make pre-show, going back to Saturday night actually, to win the ACC Tournament Championship was Clemson. And digging into some of their numbers, if you go back to when Jack Clark came back from a multitude of injuries that he suffered in the latter part of, well, it was actually in the beginning of non-conference play, but was out for the majority of the back end of non-conference play and then about the first half of ACC play. And ever since he came back healthy into the starting lineup against UNC, which Clemson won at the Dean Dome for the first time in ever against the Tar Heels on February 6th, Clemson ranks in the 85th percentile at both ends. So offensive and defensive efficiency, some of the metrics that you brought up, which is pretty good. And that has a lot to do with what Clark brings to this team, especially at the defensive end, his ability to switch 1 through 5. And Clemson can also create mismatches 1 through 5 offensively with Hall, Shefflin, and Clark able to space the floor. You also think about the bracket and the way this is going to be laid out for Clemson. You get the winner of Boston College and Miami in the finals, or actually in the first round, wouldn't be finals on Wednesday's slate, potentially the finals if Clemson loses that game. And then you face Virginia in the quarterfinals, the Who's knocked out Clemson last year in the ACC semis, and Clemson lost to them by a point earlier this season. So a lot of motivation going into that game. Also just shows you the kind of negative variance that Clemson got in some of their ACC regular season games. Speaking of 1-point losses, they lost to Duke in the regular season at Cameron Indoor. Questionable foul call late, leading to that defeat. Potentially playing Duke in the semis, and then we'll see who comes out of the top half of the bracket. Projection-wise, it would be UNC, but I like the odds that I got at 15-1. 10-1, I still show value on. I would bet them probably down to like plus 850. I make them closer to plus 750, so that's about an 11.7% implied probability. Plus 1500 was 6.25% implied probability. So I had a pretty good edge on the Tigers to win the conference tournament. Now we'll see, motivationally speaking, what that means to them, something that you and I were touching on over text. Do teams like Wake Forest and Pitt have a little bit more motivation just because they likely need to win the league tournament or at least a couple games in order to advance and get into the big dance? But what are your overall thoughts here on the ACC tournament, Eric?
Well, I'm still a big North Carolina guy, and I talked about this was the first team I put a future on to win the national championship was North Carolina. I thought they were going to be this year's UConn. Now, they don't have the fingerprint of UConn offensively. They need to do better. They need to be a top 10 offense to be in my opinion, be a national champion. They're not quite there yet, but they do actually have something to play for. We've talked earlier about my concerns about I don't like to wager so much on these major conference games because certain teams don't have something to play for. It's more bragging rights for a lot of them. They know where they're going to land, a lot of them. With North Carolina, might actually have a shot at a one line. So they might be motivated on that one. It's going to make for an intriguing semifinal game there because you're going to have Pitt potentially with Wake Forest, two teams who are desperately needing a win on the bubble. So that's going to be two teams like we had talked about. There's going to be some hungry teams that are going against a North Carolina team, which, you know, I don't know if they have something to play for. Does it matter to them that they're going to be the 1 seed or the 2 seed, but it's going to be right around that line. If they're motivated to win that 1 seed, then I think they are far and away the best team to win this conference tournament. If you look on the other side of the bracket, I like Duke. Duke is another team I have a future for the NCAA tournament. Virginia, when you get to the bottom of that, I could definitely see why you'd pick Clemson there because Virginia, you don't know what you're going to get. They have, for a good chunk of the last month, they have been dead last, 362nd in my consistency metric. They're all over the map. And I think they had a string there of, I think it was 5 straight games. I think it was 7 of 8 where they had positive ratings above their season norm. It seemed like Virginia was all of a sudden kind of turning a corner. But then after that, now all of a sudden they've missed the mark. 4 games out of 7. They've lost 3 of 5. It's just really hard to trust this Virginia team. It's I've seen these teams in the past, and sometimes you can come to these tournaments, and we saw this 2 years ago with North Carolina, one of the most inconsistent teams 2 years ago, and they made a run all the way to the championship game. But for me, more times than not, these inconsistent teams, they'll have a good game and then a bad game. You just really can't trust them in any given night. I'm still going with the favorites in this one, North Carolina and Duke. I still like North Carolina, assuming they have the motivation to get the 1 seed. I still think deep down, that's my team that I really want to be like this year's UConn in the tournament. But like I said, they just don't have the fingerprint offensively to be the national champion right now, in my opinion.
I want to go back to what you said about Virginia, too. I don't want to call, I guess I will call them lucky. Just from what we saw in some of their regular season games, you have an overtime win against NC State, Notre Dame. These are, and that was before Notre Dame really started to peak. A 1-point win over Clemson on the road that I mentioned, a 4-point win over Florida State, 2-point win over Wake Forest. So these are a 4-point win over Boston College in the third to last game before this ACC tournament. So these are 2 possession wins that, generally speaking, are coin flip games. And when you have a team that plays at such a slow tempo, you are kind of fortunate to get in these kind of circumstances. And they're not a good free throw shooting team. So if you play in close games, 350th in the country in free throw percentage. Dunn and Beekman are probably pros, but still not a lot of upside, especially in a game that's going to be shortened possession-wise, and don't want to trust this offense, even if you like Tony Bennett schematically with that pack line defense in a tournament setting. The other things that I want to say with Duke and UNC really quickly, a couple reasons why I don't love them long-term. UNC has shored things up defensively, but they rank 324th in open three-point rate attempt allowed. So giving up a lot of open threes, that has a lot to do with Baycott's ball screen defense. And with a non-agile 5 on the floor, you tend to give up more threes. That's a bit of a concern for me for a team that still may face some negative regression from behind the arc defensively. They only allowed a 30.7% clip in ACC play. And then Duke, like we saw against UNC on Saturday, giving up a decent amount of second chance opportunities, owned on the glass in that game, which we've seen against more physical competition. And then they got exploited in transition, which really hasn't happened in a while, but they also haven't faced that tough of ACC competition. And then when you go back to some of their earlier season games, like against Arkansas and Arizona, they got exposed with their fast break defense. So just a couple issues. Maybe UNC or Duke wins the ACC tournament. Maybe this isn't a letdown for UNC after the Duke win on Saturday, but a couple of reasons why I'm not as high on those two teams juxtaposed to the market.
Yeah, it's for me, I look at it and go, I was waiting for North Carolina. They looked so unbeatable earlier on in the season. Then they kind of had that lull, like we talked about before. UConn last year in early January, I think, even had that lull where they lost something like 4 or 5. For North Carolina, it was losing 3 of 5. They didn't look like the same team. They slipped in offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency, but now they seem to have turned it around. 4 positive performances in their last 6 games. All 6 are wins. It's just kind of, you never know what's going to happen. Are they peaking too soon, or are they now just getting in that groove, kind of similar to San Diego State last year, who flew into the Mountain West tournament, rolled through that, and then won 5 games en route to losing in the final of the NCAA tournament. Sometimes you can peak too early, but sometimes you're just finding your groove. And just looking at what North Carolina was able to do earlier this season, going back into December up until the end of January, that was such a dominant team. They slipped for a little bit, but now it seems like they've sorted things out. I like their long-term outlook.
And looking at that projected matchup that you mentioned in the semifinals, it would be UNC is about a 5-point favorite over both Pitt and Wake Forest. My question for you is, and I know I kind of shot down Pitt on a couple podcasts ago just because Jack Clark, who I mentioned for Clemson, did a great job guarding Blake Hinson. And I mean, Pitt needs Hinson to get going from 3 if they're going to want to upset UNC in that potential matchup. Along with, you have a high variance team in the Panthers. So would that potential regression concern you at all for UNC's perimeter defense against a team like Pitt that is so 3-point heavy?
That's really hard to say. It's anything could happen. Anything could happen in these tournaments. It's really hard to ballpark exactly what's going to happen. I've gone out there and I projected these teams to be 3-point heavy and just drain everything in sight. And then all of a sudden they go 1 of 17 out of the blue. The weird things happen in conference tournaments. So in that situation, it would be really difficult to say. I will say this about Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh has a far better resume than a lot of people are giving him credit for. I think, that's one of the teams that I actually have in the field and most people probably don't. So I think they have more to play for. And I think a lot of Pitt fans would probably agree with me, obviously, but, it's going to really be dependent on if they can get past Wake Forest. If Wake Forest takes them out, I'm pretty sure Pitt's a goner. But it'll be interesting if Pitt all of a sudden gets a win over Wake Forest and North Carolina, assuming those games actually do matter to the committee, which is a question mark. It's a big question mark. If Pitt goes a long ways and then say loses in the final, is it going to make a difference to the committee? I think Pitt has a pretty good resume and deserves better credit, but I'm probably in the minority on that one.
Maybe if they beat UNC hypothetically in the semifinal, just because we saw Clemson get the double bye in the ACC tournament last year. They lose to Virginia in the semifinal, don't get to the ACC title game at the least, and then you don't get a bid in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, right. And the one I think of, like, too, I was tweeting about this earlier. Texas A&M, remember a couple of years ago, Texas A&M was a team that was right on the bubble, and they beat Florida, who was right around number 50, and then back to back they beat Auburn, and they beat it was Auburn and Arkansas back to back, and they lose in the final to Tennessee. That is the kind of thing that I'm like, a lot of people thought that was going to get them in the tournament, but it didn't. And that's where I'm kind of like, that's why I'm always kind of doubting about anything that happens after like Thursday night into Friday morning. It's like, does it really matter at that point? Now, at that point, will they have enough under their belt? If the game they play against, for example, if Pittsburgh beats Wake Forest, and then the game against North Carolina would be on Friday, would it happen early enough that the selection committee would actually take it under consideration? That's a big question mark. I don't know for sure about that.
Not that I want to stay on the topic of at-large teams, but really quickly, just because of what we saw in the Missouri Valley Conference Tournament Championship with Drake holding off Indiana State in the final few minutes. I think Indiana State faced as large of a 18-point second-half deficit. What do you make of the Sycamore's chances?
Well, the Sycamore, oh boy, that's going to be problematic because it's going to be one of those situations where everybody's going to look at the record and they're going to say, "Come on, look at this team that's 28-6." But when you look at the stuff that's there that is valued by the committee, there is not a lot of meat on that bone. A lot of people are saying basically the win, you're hanging your head on a win over Drake. There's a lot of people. Let's face it. They all want to see Robbie Avila. That's the big motivation behind the people that want to see Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the NCAA tournament. Unfortunately, it's really going to be really dicey for them. I think they're right around the cut line right now. For me, they're basically the second team outside the field. Now that can work in their favor. It can work against them because if those teams that are currently in the field all of a sudden start falling off again, which they very well may do if Wake Forest loses to Pitt, and Pitt's too far below Indiana State. If Texas A&M fails, if Villanova falls, all of a sudden this is all going to help Indiana State. The question is there going to be a team out there that can come out of the blue like a UNLV who's not supposed to be in the tournament, all of a sudden wins the Mountain West and steals a bid and knocks Indiana State down a notch? Is that going to be a problematic? I think Indiana State at this point, probably has a pretty good shot at being in the discussion for a play-in team in Dayton. That's what feels right to me at this point.